Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's Yoma class.
This class is is going to be offered every Friday for 5 weeks, just to give a taste of Masechet Yoma, the tractate in the Mishnah, the first kind of codification of rabbinic law, from which we get most of what we know about the observance of Yom Kippur, although, as we said last week, the first 7 chapters of Masechet Yoma deal not with the Yom Kippur that we observe, but mostly the Yom Kippur that was observed in the temple and the specifics of the Kohen Gadol and his service in the Holy Place on that day. But still, it is something worthy of explanation. We began last week with a quick read of the first Mishnah, Masechet Yoma, and then we were part of the way through a kind of a slower read of the text. So the quick read was Shivat Yamim Kodem Yom Kippurim, 7 days before Yom Kippur, Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mi Beito. It's a plural verb, so some group of people separate the Kohen Gadol from his house. And we discussed how his house is really a reference not only to his physical house, but to his wife. Lilishkat Palhedrin, to the chamber of, it's translated here, of counselors. We're going to look deeper into that word today. Umatkinin lo Kohen Acher Tachtav. They would set aside for him a stand-in Kohen, who was not yet a Kohen Gadol, to substitute for him, Shema Ye'erabo Psul, unless just in case something happened to disqualify him. Rabbi Yehuda said, Af Isha Acheret Matkinin Lo. We even set aside for him a separate wife. Why? Shema Tamut Ishto. What if his wife dies while he's in that preparation for Yom Kippur, even on Yom Kippur? Shneimar, because it says, V'chiper ba'ado u'ba'ad beito. It says declaratively in Parshat Acharei Mot that one of the things he must ask for atonement for is for himself and for his house. Beito, his house, zo ishto, which is his wife. And notice how that implicitly suggests that in the second line of the Mishnah, that when it says that we separate the Kohen Gadol from his house, we are saying that we are separating him from his wife. Amru lo, they said back to Rabbi Yehuda, what are you, crazy? Im kain, if that's the case, ein ledavar sov. We'd have to set up a replacement for replacement and a replacement for replacement for replacement. So he suggests that there's no reason to set aside a secondary wife. Okay, I want to look at that word palhedrin with you for a second. So now I'm going to share a different screen. Look at, is that being shared right now? You seeing the?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the Jastrow Dictionary of the Talmud. In some ways, it still is to me one of the most remarkable Jewish books ever written. Worked on for several decades, completed in the 1920s, I believe, and it basically is a dictionary of every single word and root that appears in all of rabbinic literature, in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Midrash, in the Targums, in the Aramaic translations of the Torah and the Tanakh, and in an era obviously before online editing. And the amount of information that Professor Marcus Jastrow had in his mind, was able to bring together this organized, is unbelievable. If you look at the bottom right of the page, if you look up palhedrin in the Jastrow, it sends you the word parhedrin. There are a lot of Hebrew Aramaic words that were borrowed from the Greek, and once they got borrowed, they got bastardized a little bit. So the way they appear in some texts is not the original. And you'll see here, I cannot read the Greek itself. I don't read Greek letters, but he translates parhedrin as assessors or counselors. And he actually gives us our text. When I was in yeshiva, this was called a Jastrow jackpot. When you looked up a word in Jastrow to find out what it meant, and the example that Jastrow gave to help you understand what that word was the very text you were studying, right? And he gives us that language, Lilishkat Parhedrin, to the counselor's cell, name of an apartment in the temple precincts. So we come out of that for a second and go back to the other one. That they were taking him to this place called it's written as Palhedrin here. It's Parhedrin in the probably in the original. And what was it? For that, we should look at a commentary below on the Bartanura. Okay, so the Bartanura, Rabbi Ovadia Bartanura, who wrote one of the classic commentaries on the Mishnah and still studied today, an Italian commentator from the Middle Ages. Look what he says on Lelishkat Palhedrin, because it says something interesting about what religious leadership was like then, and we can ask a question as to what extent it has changed, or it hasn't. Pikidei HaMelech Nikraim Palhedrin. Advisors of the king are called Palhedrin. So the first thing he says is this word is not at the core a spiritual word. It's not at the core a temple kind of a word. It's a palace kind of a word, right? So there was apparently a room near the Holy of Holies where the Kohen Gadol would sleep before Yom Kippur, and it's taken from a word that has nothing to do with temple worship. It has to do with palace coterie. ומתוך שהכהנים הגדולים שהיו בבית שני אחר שמעון הצדיק, and because the series of high priests that served during the Second Temple after one particularly well-known and well-regarded high priest called Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, hayu notnim mamon, they would pay kedei l'shemesh bekuna gdola. They would pay money in order to serve in that post. We might have a romantic image that for the centuries that the temple stood, that no one was more beyond reproach than the high priest, right? A descendant not only of the Levi tribe and not only of Aaron, but and well regarded enough by his community or his colleagues that he would serve as the high priest of that generation. Apparently, according to the Bartanura, built into what this word means is that we have a history of Kohanim Dolim, high priests, who would bribe officials to get into the post. It was considered to be a posh job. Umitoch shirishayim hayu, because they were not good people. They were evil. The high priest who would serve in that role, who was going into the Kohen, to the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur to beg atonement for himself and for his house/wife and for all the people of Israel. Generations of them were Rishayim. Lo hayu mashlimim. They would not complete their terms. Right? So these were short-term high priests because their evilness was made apparent while they were serving. V'hayu mitchalfin kol shnei masar chodesh. They would switch every 12 months. Like pikidei hamelach, like advisors to the king. There's some sense that in the ancient world you didn't spend very long as an advisor to a king. Either you fell out of grace with the king, or it was considered a short-term post no matter what. Shehamelach machlifan kol shana. The king would switch his advisors every year. Lechach, therefore, nikrat lishkazo. This chamber in which the high priest would sleep was called, cynically, lishkat palhedrin, the chamber of the king advisors, the chamber of the counselors, right? Because the idea was that for the generations in which that particular high priest was serving, those high priests were serving, the rotation of high priests was similar to the rotation of counselors to the king. They come in, they come out, and therefore the place in which they would prepare for the holiest day of the year would be called by this rather cynical title. I see that Norm Green raised his hand. Norm, you can unmute yourself.
I wonder if this is, by Bartanura, sort of a way of castigating the Sadducees in the temple service generally, because it seems rather harsh to think that year after year after year they were selecting and selling the high priesthood to these terrible people, all of whom would proceed to die within a year. It just seems rather an extreme thing to say and very, makes one very cynical and unappreciative of the temple service altogether.
Right. I think you're right, Norm. I think the cynicism doesn't extend from Bartanura per se. It extends from the Mishnah, right? So if you want to take both an overly simple but probably not that inaccurate understanding of the rabbinic take on the priestly class, right? There are plenty of diatribes against the wickedness of the holy temple and the wickedness of the leadership there. There are some really painful stories in Masechet Yoma in the Talmud about how not only money hungry but bloodthirsty the priestly class had become. And it's very possible to read a lot of that material as an intentional polemic against the priestly class as the rabbinic class was emerging from them, right? For hundreds of years, authority in the Jewish tradition emerged from birthright, whom you were born to, right? It's the extension of the Genesis model where people are vying for spotlight based on the order of their birth and to whom they were born. That's the Kohanic model, right? The rabbinic model is that you gain your authority not by who your parents were, but what you've studied, whom you know, maybe who your spiritual parents were, what teachers taught you, right? So is it the case that every author that we come across in the Mishnah individually had a negative attitude towards the kahuna? No. But these texts are emerging in a convulsive time where the temple structure is literally falling apart and then is going to be destroyed. The rabbis are taking it upon themselves to rebuild all of Jewish society in those embers, and they harbor some cynical views towards how their spiritual predecessors who had been in charge, the Sadducees and the priests, handled authority. So I think you're right. I think Bartenura is not kind of creating that in the 15th century. I think he's actually accurate in terms of the origin of the word Palhedrin/Parhedrin. Okay, so I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about Bartenura's understanding of why there's even this notion of a 7-day period that the Kohen Gadol would have to recluse himself before Yom Kippur, right? So that's how the Mishnah began. That's how the tractate began. The tractate begins with 7 days before Yom Kippur, right? So why? And that really begins a day after Rosh Hashanah. So I want to do two things with you quickly. Look at this verse from Vayikra chapter 8, dealing with not Yom Kippur. This is not from Parshat Acharei Mot. I think it's from Parshat Tzav. It might be Shmini, but I think it's Tzav. Dealing with the ceremony inaugurating the first class, the first cohort of priests who would serve in the Mishkan, in the desert, not the temple in Jerusalem. This is still Torah. So we have this verse. Umipetach Ohel Moed. From the entrance of the Ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting, Lo Teitzu Shiv'at Yamim. They, this class of inaugural priests, would not leave for 7 days. Ad Yom Melot Yemei Meluechem, until you complete the days of your. The root here is malay, full. It's translated as ordination. There was this sense of like a preparatory set of days that the priests in training would go through before they'd be formally brought in and fulfilling their roles as high priests. Ki shivat yamim yimalei et yedchem, because it's going to take 7 days to prepare you. Kasher asa bayom hazeh, just as God has done today. Tziva Adonai. La'asot lechaper alechem. So it's kind of that verse 34 seems to be redundant. Just as what's been done today, God has commanded that it be done to bring you expiation, atonement. Okay, so Bartenura, same commentator, on this line of the Mishnah, not on our verse, but I wanted you to have the verse in your mind. Mafrishin Kohen Gadol. They would separate the high priest. Shekol avodot Yom Kippurim. All of the sacrifices and worship services of Yom Kippur, ein kashrut elabo. It's got to be him. He's the one who has to do it. It's only kosher if it happens through him. Shene'amar gabe Yom Kippurim, as it says regarding Yom Kippur from Parshat Acharei Mot, Vayikra chapter 16, verse 32, v'chiper hakohen asher yimshach oto. That who's doing this atonement service? The Kohen, who is going to have been anointed. The one of the ways of referring to the Kohen Gadol is not only Kohen Gadol, but Kohen, the anointed one, the one, it's the same root as Mashiach. The Hafrasha Zo, and this separation, Nafgalan, we learn it from Midichtiv, from what it says, the Shivat Yemei HaMiluim, from the 7 days of the inaugural ordination ceremony, from the verse that we looked at before, the 8th chapter Vayikra. Umipetach Ohel Moed Lo Teitzu Shivat Yemim. God said to the student priests, do not leave this tent of meeting for 7 days. Uchativ Batre, and it said right after that, I brought you that verse also, Kasher Asa Bayom Hazeh, just as God has done today, Tziva Adonai, God commanded Lasot Lechaper Alechem, to do in order to bring atonement for yourselves. V'darshu rabotenu, and somewhere else in halachic midrash, the rabbis learned out, interpreted, that the word, this should be really in quotations, la'asot, from that second half of the second verse, to do. Ze ma'aseh para, this is the action of the para aduma, the red heifer whose ashes would be mixed in some admixture to bring cleansing to someone who had contact with the deceased, meaning that there was also a 7-day period leading up to that ritual. And this should also be in quotes, L'chaper alechem, the two words at the end of the verse having nothing to do with Yom Kippur, has to do with the ordination ceremony, but the Torah, hears evocative words in one verse and associates it with other words. At least that's the midrashic way of wielding Torah verses. Since it said in the verse regarding the ordination ceremony, L'chaper alechem, to bring atonement upon you, ze ma'aseh Yom HaKippurim. This must be referring to the ritual of Yom Kippur. Sheha-kohen hasoref et hapara, the kohen who would burn the red heifer in order to prepare the ritual. The ha-kohen haoved b'Yom Kippurim, and the priest that would serve on Yom Kippur, shnehem, according to this midrashic readout, both of them, ti'unim hafrasha, they both require separation, mi beitam, from their houses, read houses as also spouses. Shivat yamim, for 7 days. Kemosha yu ti'unim Aharon uvanav b'shivat yemei hamiluim. Just as the first priest and high priest required separation on the original moment of ordination. So that fleshes out a little bit the text, which if we just read the text raw, it gives us information, but not a whole lot of depth. Now we have a little bit more depth, right? That the moment of Yom Kippur in the rabbinic mind is not a standalone moment. It's a redux of the original moment in which the concept of the priesthood was formed in the book of Leviticus, right? So the book of Leviticus, chapter 8, talks about the forming of the priesthood. By chapter 16, we're talking about Yom Kippur ceremony, and the Midrash connects those two together so that the 7-day waiting period to become a priest gets recapitulated by the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur. We've learned that the rabbinic, this is the first Mishnah of the tractate dealing with the holiest day of the year. And the first Mishnah in that tractate is already, at least in some ways, looking askance on the very person who's going to be the subject of the next 7 chapters of Masechet Yoma. Right, so it's not until the 8th chapter of Masechet Yoma that we kind of get to a description of the holiday that we can understand, and it's not just, as Norm said, that there was some cynicism on behalf of the rabbinic class vis-a-vis the Sadducee class. The rabbinic class is going to devote 7 chapters to this ritual, but it starts it off by saying, "Don't be that impressed by these folks." Don't be that impressed by these folks. How we insert that into our understanding of Yom Kippur, particularly when we get to the Avodah service and we try to kind of enter into the pomp and the circumstance and the smoke and the intensity and the notion that the people were outside the Holy of Holies waiting for an answer from the Kohen Gadol. There are many versions of that movie, right? There's the version of the movie that the person inside the Holy of Holies is the most beloved and honored person in the generation. And there are versions of the movie which have played out in religious settings and in political settings and in communal settings from time immemorial till now, where the person who is the focus and has the spotlight on him or her for doing the most important deed of that society is one that is not necessarily having gained the proper respect, and therefore may not be the most appropriate person to that particular act. I'm not bringing this up to you for you to look askance upon the rabbis of your community in terms of how we officiate Yom Kippur, but to recognize that for thousands of years there has been both the import of spiritual leadership at the head of the community performing rituals and acts that the community was not necessarily fully educated to do. And there was a rabbinic revolt against that to try to democratize religious experience because there was some concern about what happened when so much power got concentrated in one person. And then we can say on that the rabbis of the Talmud also fell victim to some of that, of those traps. And there's plenty of material in rabbinic literature about one rabbi calling out another rabbi for acting too priestly. So we'll pause there. I was hoping we were going to start another Mishnah today. Next week, I'll just give you a heads up. We're going to jump to Mishnah 1, Chapter 1, Mishnah 3, and talk about what the priest would spend his time doing before Yom Kippur itself. And I think I'll do one more Mishnah from this early material, and then I'll do a couple of Mishnayot from Chapter 8, which actually talk about the holiday as we know it. So that's the class for today. Michael, any questions?
Yes. It seems that a separation of 7 days has been used in other contexts before a momentous event, and I'm thinking about the separation of a Chatan and Kala before the wedding. And in fact, the last day of that is a day of fasting, almost like Yom Kippur. It seems to be some kind of relation. I don't know if there is anything conscious like that.
In rabbinic literature, one of the words or nicknames for a wedding is a Yom Kippur Katan. It's called a miniature wedding day, right? The groom wears a kittel. There's fasting. The bride and groom, particularly if they're getting married, if you get married in the afternoon and you have mincha before the wedding, which happens in religious communities, the bride and the groom say the version of the mincha that we say Erev Yom Kippur with the full list of al chaitz, right? So there are many associations. We think of a wedding day as joyful, and we think of Yom Kippur as solemn, but there's actually a lot of solemnity to a wedding day. And there's also a lot of joy on Yom Kippur, which we talk about sometimes at the Avodah service in the sanctuary when we end with Marei Kohen, that wonderful poem about what the Kohen looked like when he came out of the Holy of Holies. And we sing it to a kind of a spirited tune because it was a celebration. He did it, right? Well, all the cynicism aside, there was a lot riding in the hearts and minds of the Jewish people on what the high priest was going to be able to accomplish in the chamber. So yes, I do think there are many associations there. Let me release you to your days. Yom Tov, Shabbat Shalom, and see you hopefully soon and frequently.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.